we have on the agenda for you today, which we are very excited about today, is we have a keynote from Professor Soteria Grech, who is Professor in European and Global Education Governance at the University of Edinburgh. And she will talk to us today about conceptualizing missing purposes. So this is in answer also to some of the very important questions that came up after the previous session, saying, what are the assumptions? What are the purposes? What is it that we actually want these data for? And she will be followed by Dr. Pali Lehohla, who is the founder of the Pan-African Institute for Evidence, who will give us some comments on Soteria's presentation today. So I'm thrilled to invite them both now to share their thoughts with us. Soteria, please.
Yes, thank you, Moira. I'll just share my screen if I can. Okay, here we are. I hope you can all see it fine. Yeah, excellent. I should start by, first of all, thanking NORRAG, thanking Moira and Daniel in particular for inviting me to be part of this wonderful conversation. I have to say, mostly I take part in kind of academic conferences, and it's not often that I have the opportunity to have such a broad, diverse audience to discuss with. So this is a particularly important day for me. I'd like to start, I kind of change the title just a little bit, because what I'm going to be talking about, what I'm going to be presenting is work that I have been doing over the last 4 years on the work of quantification by international organizations. And we have particularly and obviously having looked at the development of expertise more broadly and education expertise in particular. So without further ado, the presentation is the findings I'm going to be presenting today are also based on data, not the kind of data that we've been discussing about today, but mostly qualitative data and some social network analysis as well from this project, the METRO project that is funded by the European Research Council, and which really began from the premise that there were what we saw back in 2015, 2016, when I wrote a proposal, were increasing alliances and interdependencies between international organizations, and the project saw these international organizations like UNESCO, like the OECD, the World Bank, as the main producers of statistical knowledge, of data. So what we set out to do is first examine the interdependencies of international organizations in producing global metrics, and also develop new theory on the role of quantification in these changing interrelationships between IOs, and then the impact that these new alliances have on international organizations themselves and transnational governance more broadly. The project worked with 4 different case studies, one of which was the SDG 4. We also looked at sustainability, we looked at poverty, and we also looked at statistical capacity development. So in trying to trace, expertise and what expertise means and how expertise changed, really my starting point of analysis is this work in the 1990s by Gibbons and Novotny on what they call kind of the new production of knowledge, what they called Mode 2. So the rationale behind their work back in the 1990s was that Mode 2 in that was this observation that a change in social values and practices inevitably results in an evolution of the epistemic structures of society. So what they argued is that a new model of knowledge production was emerging, and this was the replacement of traditional science, what they called Mode 1, with new knowledge production, kind of evidence-based policy, for example, more practical application of knowledge, what they called Mode 2. So this table here summarizes, if you like, these key shifts that were identified in mode 2 knowledge production. So again, not something that we see today. I'm going to talk in a moment about the evolution of expertise through really the work of the SDGs, but what we experienced back in the 1990s. So this was the move from the production of knowledge away from academic contexts only to the context of application. So applied knowledge is much more important. The shift away from disciplinarity, so kind of looking at disciplines almost separately, to transdisciplinarity, so bringing different disciplines together in the understanding of social problems. The move away from the production of homogeneous knowledge just by universities to knowledge produced by a diversity of organizations and actors. And of course, international organizations became the key research agencies that pushed for this shift. Also, the shift from the production of knowledge as an autonomous endeavor, almost kind of the old knowledge for knowledge's sake, versus knowledge produced for, having social needs in mind and being really reflexive about the impact of this knowledge production. And finally, from academic peer review as the only way to quality control knowledge towards quality control that is extended to users. So users, i.e. policymakers, practitioners, evaluate the knowledge in itself. Okay, so just to kind of now explore and show you some of the findings of the project across the SDGs, but also in particular on the SDG 4, and how expertise has actually evolved and developed and changed quite a bit since the 1990s. Although kind of mode 2, if you like, put the spotlight on producing knowledge away from the ivory tower towards these specific policy issues and problems. Yeah, what we observe is that the context now is not specific. There is no context. The context is global. So there is a certain universality that binds us all together and is greatly enhanced by discourses of risk, uncertainty, emergency. So we see the SDGs discourse in the SDGs, all countries around the world are considered as developing. There is no more that distinction between developed and developing countries, something that we, for example, saw with the MDGs, what was before the Millennium Development Goals. Further, and I'll come back to this again later, quantification in the SDG era has different characteristics because it is premised on this open, inclusive, and participatory nature of the consultative process, which contrasts again with the more technocratic origins of the MDGs. So this is a co-constructed universal agenda with strong moral undertones, and with legitimacy being built through the implication of decision makers, practitioners, policymakers, the civil society within its own structures and mechanisms. Another point here is that due to the impact of quantification and the social and political work of constructing it, when all these actors become part of actually putting together the monitoring agenda, at least at the global level, what we see is a recalibration of policy arenas so that they're now much closer interconnected than ever before. For example, at least in the fields that we have investigated in the project, we see that sustainability is not simply discussed as one of the many broad aims of education, but sustainable development is now at the core of education targets and aims. Sustainable development, on the other hand, can only be measured through examining education, poverty, health, etc., etc. New language emerges. People talk about learning poverty, or health literacy, or data deprivation, and many other terms, which of course have effects in the ways people think and understand their worlds. So some of the questions I think that have already arisen, in the last couple of hours in our discussion is who is actually missing here from this universal agenda? Are we is there a we, as Radhika Gorur posed in the chat box earlier? Are we all in this together? Or are there local needs that we haven't still taken into account of? Are there underrepresented groups? And I think Marcos gave a pretty good explanation of, yes, absolutely, there are, you know, indigenous groups, people on the move, people with disabilities, people that are still the unaccounted for in the SDG4 framework. And finally, and perhaps more importantly, what do we gain and what do we lose when trying to square, if you like, that circle of devising global learning metrics and at the same time building kind of robust local education statistical systems so that we continue to care and look after kind of local needs and have these as our first, like as our priority. One last point here, although, you know, SDGs, the SDG4 moved away from, if you like, the specificity of the target of the MDGs, kind of looking more at input data, kind of enrollment and access in education, into kind of actually devising a much broader universal set of goals in relation to education. Do they still all count the same? Do we collect data? Are there the data sets to fulfill all these different targets? Or has the political almost entered into the technical, devised and presented as goals and different indicators and targets? But in fact, the focus still is on some very specific, if you like, older and more one-sided views of what education should be about. And here, obviously, I'm talking about measuring literacy and numeracy. Okay, moving down the table, if you like. So here, what we have, kind of mode 1 knowledge production happened predominantly in silos, so university departments, schools, research councils, but mode 2 saw these policy problems as inherently transdisciplinary. And indeed, in our research, we found that although there seemed to be a commitment to working in transdisciplinary ways, in reality, due to the great disjointedness, diversification of knowledge production, economics emerged as a great unifier. Therefore, we see strongly in all our cases, not only education, these complex and overlapping global challenges do not lead to interdisciplinarity, but rather in monodisciplinarity. And economics becomes the universal language of global policy as it enables communication between these different technical and policy groupings. So economization here happens at 2 levels and in 2 ways. First, it happens through the professional positioning of economists within the organizations. Across our cases, the vast majority of experts in international organizations that we interviewed had studied economics, and many of them were being self-identified as, say, education economists, or health economists, or environmental economists, or just simply economists who were running whole departments. Secondly, the economization occurs through an expansion of an economic way of thinking and defining the problems. So the problems are governed when they're measured, as you know very well, through indicators, targets, benchmarks, and cost-benefit analysis. As such, the central way of knowing problems is through these economic instruments. What's more, these tools become forums for policy debate itself. For example, in the case of the SDG4, it was really evidence from national economic growth figures that created that novel argument about the need to move away from kind of the classic education statistics that measured enrollment rates and investment in education, completion rates, etc., towards the devising really of global learning metrics. So the question that arises for us here today, what are the missing perspectives? You know, are there other epistemologies, other perspectives, other disciplines that could actually enter the conversation and inform it? For example, I mean, we all know that economics have a very specific way of understanding the world, that growth is always the target, that improvement is always possible, that there is a linear trajectory of needing to move upwards, the scale. What if, anthropologists were on the table? What if we had more sociologists contributing, historians, in fact, and we always forget about learning from history and very often found ourselves kind of more or less reinventing the wheel. What about education researchers themselves? They don't figure out so prominently in these monitoring agendas, in these meetings and gatherings of deciding. And what is of course the perspectives of the civil society, of teachers, of professional, of regional organizations. We did quite a lot of interviews with actors from these fields also, not only international organizations, and very often what a lot of them said is that yes, they do participate in these meetings, in these technical meetings, and they're there to give their approval. However, their participation, they found, is quite passive. Their role is of rubber stamping, or just watchdogs trying to find out what is happening, rather than actually having constructive, active participation. And perhaps that might be because of this monodisciplinarity, this very specific way of viewing and understanding education in the world. So moving on from kind of heterogeneity and organizational diversity, here I think really it's perhaps the project's, if you like, most startling finding so far. Was the fact really that looking at international organizations from the beginning, we thought we would be examining centers of calculation, right? The organizations where numbers are produced. However, the people who we have been interviewing so far and who hold key positions in these organizations are usually former statisticians who act as brokers between the different levels and actors who are in the system. So their work might entail local work, or they might be managing technical meetings, or they could be combining the development of methodologies to make data fit the indicators and then try to persuade national member countries on why some indicators were kept and others dropped. Some of them would find that these processes of reaching agreement and of opening up the indicator debate, as the phrase is, to all was a particularly important aspect of the legitimization and eventually the success of the project, whilst others were adamant that these long consultations were harming the technical robustness of the monitoring exercise and that swifter action was necessary. So this continuous brokerage work that we find international organizations doing is important for two reasons. First of all, it allows them to adopt different identities for different audiences through their relationships with participant nations, other international organizations, research agencies, donors very often, and also creates a necessary bridge between technocratic and political accountability, which of course is essential in a monitoring program of this magnitude and influence, and therefore gives them further legitimation and kind of almost symbolic capital as purveyors of technocracy and democracy. Questions again arise. What are the missing methods and the politics, of this all? Through this politicization of the measurement spaces, quantification and datafication have become actually the primary venues where politics are conducted. It's like here, look what we're doing today. We're talking about what is missing. What are the missing data, as if this is the only way to understand and talk about education. But this is actually is what we have at hand here. The minute, education actors were invited in the technical discussions, and the SDG4 created this very broad spectrum of education values that actually turned into goals, we actually gained something, but also lost quite a lot. And it was almost the technical and the political have now come so close together that it's almost impossible to take them apart. But can all educational aims be quantified? Are there other methods of producing scientific evidence that might serve us equally well? And here I have to say, I've been working for the last almost 20 years as an education researcher with qualitative data, and I'm pretty pleased about the findings of my research. So there are definitely other methods that we should bring to the table. It's not just quantitative data that we need here. And lastly, and I think that's an important point, because I find the brokerage work is absolutely crucial and has to happen, and someone has to do it. And I understand that international organizations were brought in the picture to actually do this kind of work, probably more than just the statistical work. But we have to be careful here, because it might actually allow double speak, as I call it provocatively, and I'm waiting for all your comments at the end. But we see on the one hand, UNESCO producing the Futures of Education report, a fantastic report in all its arguments, very kind of broadly acknowledged, but on the other hand, we also see UNESCO kind of pushing on with the devising of global learning metrics, pushing on with the work on learning poverty, kind of taking a very specific agenda forward, and maybe not paying as much attention to other educational goals and indicators. So we have to be careful about what is happening here, and about this very close, if you like, interdependency, this mix of political and technical in the same venues. Okay, for the interest of time, I won't go much into data-fied accountability. I think, we all know very well that this is how schools have become accountable nowadays. I want to focus a little bit more on this second point, on user reflexivity. And although I did not give an example before, I'd like to do this here. So this is the Better Life Index by the OECD. And although it looks familiar, it actually isn't. This is a ranking, but not as we normally know rankings to look like. So the index recreates this meadow, as you can see, kind of full of colorful flowers with numerous different, with numerous petals of different colors and sizes. So if you see here, the country names serve as the stems of these flowers. But rather than ranked in terms of performance, what would normally be the case with a ranking, right? This is the default alphabetical order of the countries in the index. If you zoom on any flower, this is what you see. So every color-coded petal represents an individual well-being indicator. And there is an explicit invitation to the user, as you see at the top, create your Better Life Index. And obviously, you can adjust the significance that several aspects of kind of social life carry according to your own preferences, and create your own flowers. So what do we have here? It's really the user's own preferences that are the engines behind the construction, and the potential for multiple reconstructions of their ideal flower. So it's the user's preferences that are key here, their own constructed reality, their views, what kind of worlds they create, and what matters most. So there is an increasing, I'd say, number of data visualizations also in the field of education, and SDG4 in particular, that do not necessarily continue to work as these killer graphs of the PISA tables, for example, although these, of course, continue to exist. Crucially, as I discussed, the SDGs are a country-led process, with countries needing to not simply agree, but crucially approve the technical recommendations that they're given. So in this context, the multivocality, these multiple voices of these kinds of data visualizations, transforms them into alignment devices that helps secure country buy-in in these global performance measurement exercises. So the visuals we analyzed in the project are no longer the strong judgment devices, such as league tables used to be, for example, with the PISA data. Rather, they are conceived and designed to allow the user to create their own rankings. Therefore, we observe a move away from the emphasis on experts' reflexivity only towards also the reflexivity of users themselves. And this is a certain kind of world making that only numbers allow. Again, I think this raises important questions. Are we missing league tables? Absolutely not. This is not what I'm here to say at all. However, I want to invite you to think whether these actually softer data visuals, these softer graphs, do they invite more reflexive approaches? But are we also missing of different ways of viewing the world? Are they too packaged, too specific, too, again, data-driven for us to think about educational values, educational needs, local needs, how we need to reconceptualize, maybe change how we do education data collection. And secondly, and more importantly, I think, is comparison and competition our only means of knowing and dealing with education inequity? I understand I'm almost moving, I'm out of time, so I'll just push on with the very last slide. And here, again, in mode 2 kind of territory in the 90s, it was this quality control by users. What we have here is what we call market quality control. And in order to understand this new quality control, we first need to acknowledge that on the global stage, we're not dealing with one measure of, let's say, poverty or education, but with a multiplicity of actually competing measures. This is the market of indicators. This rise of competition over measurement structures the relationships between international organizations into market-like connections. The production of indicators is their key organizational remit. Therefore, the organizations have actually, of course, vested interests in promoting the implementation of their measures over others. As a result, what we observe is not merely kind of this governing by numbers, but rather a navigation of a market of indicators. In this setting, the measures are not assessed actually based on their epistemic qualities. For example, how well they capture the reality of poverty or literacy or pandemic preparedness, for that matter, but rather on their market share. This market share is measured through the number of countries choosing to follow the indicator. In other words, the measure is of high quality if it is widely used. And this is, of course, a big part of the brokering work that international organizations do. On the other hand, there are different ways to do this. For example, in education, as my colleague Clara Fontevilla suggested, there is this approach also of no data set left behind, kind of following this stepping stone approach as the UNESCO Institute of Statistics did, and go and create composite indicators where different bits are brought together so that everyone is happy. Again, I think this poses very significant questions, which I open for you to discuss. Should this competition between different indicators be the defining feature of how we do education governance? And what is the place of judgment, of democratic politics, of citizen deliberation in deciding and agreeing on these educational aims? Where are the venues where we envisage and put in practice our plans and dreams of a better world, a more education, equitable world, a more sustainable world. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll just pass back to Daniel or Moira. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that fantastic keynote, Sateria. We've had comments in the chat already saying how fantastic that was, and that absolutely critical thought about how we actually make sure that the data are being used in ways that increase participation and support that kind of democratic accountability. Thank you so much for that. And now we have Dr. Pali Lehohla, who is the founder of the Pan-African Institute for Evidence, who will give us some short remarks in response to Sateria's presentation, and then Daniel will moderate the question and answer session with the audience after that. Pali, please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I thought as the presentation was going forward, and thank you very much for that very interesting presentation, Jessica. And thank you very much for allowing me to contribute to this discussion. And it appears that there are three issues at stake of what positions do those who are interested in education for own purposes or for any other purpose act as advocates, as collaborators, and as brokers moving to a particular direction to deliver a particular good. And I thought that perhaps I should also share a screen, which I seem not to, I have to just check what, oh yes, I have a screen to share here that I think about how do we deal with this multiple tyrannies, particularly the tyranny, data as tyranny, and advocacy as bulldozing others into this tyranny of data, and then utilization as the basis for saying then there is quality. Is utilization engagement or utilization bulldozing others into this action? I'll go through a few slides here, and I've titled Tyranny of Data and Utilization, my presentation. But I would like to go to Nelson Mandela, and I hope you will hear what he says here in defining probably the problem in a more emphatic way. That's me here. He was releasing the census results of 1996, amongst which education statistics was there. And he made an interesting intervention. And I will.
What is the position with the blacks in this country with African standards and Indians? In most cases, they were excluded from schools. To say it is less of tertiary education because you did not have the facilities. You could not go to the best schools in the country, which are well equipped, when able you to grasp sophisticated concepts and construct. The environment between the school and the home was totally different. You come to parents, some of whom have never seen the inside of a school.
Now, what is it that we are searching? Molana was seen by a friend looking around, and the wise man asked him, Molana, what is the problem? Molana said, I have lost my coin. And he asked him, Molana, where did you lose your coin? He said, I do not know. If I knew, I would have gone to where I lost it. The question was, why are you looking for it here? Molana said, this is where there is light. Now, is the tyranny, are the numbers the wherewithal of informing the field of education? Here you are seeing South Africa, years back, this is how the station looked like, and a student will be waiting for a train to ride in that. Here is how that station looks like today, and there cannot be a student who stands there. So there are determinants and drivers of success in education. If you look at Soweto, you will find that Verwoerd in 1953 in Parliament asked the question, what is the use of teaching a Bantu child? The people that Mandela is referring to who excluded mathematics when he cannot use it in practice. In many countries, I'm sure, these kinds of problems in different quantums and in different forms have actually been seen, which one would call the determinants of success in education. In 1976, Soweto rose and students rose and protested against apartheid. Some of the determinants, and you find out in this situation in South Africa, and those who do statistics will be startled by these statistics, where 60% of fathers say they are legally married against 35% of mothers. So the question is, how or rather to 31% of mothers, how does this add up? That twice the number in a country that is not polygamous, although the former president was, Mr. Zuma, but it's not polygamous, seems to be generating polyandry, where women marry more men. Now, the schizophrenia that emerges in families where fathers believe that they are fathers and married creates problems for children. Now, the SDGs have been very amazing in terms of bringing the lens of measurement closer to where it should function, which is the interdisciplinarity that occurs, leaving one behind, equity, prosperity, and planet, invest in the future. And here is where education sits, but education intersects with all these other elements that actually have to be included. So a linear statistical measurement is actually corrected by the SDGs, although not fully, because it is the statisticians that sit and preside over this. And then, of course, our MDGs have fostered a lot more system thinking. And I think I'll argue that it is this systems thinking from the MDGs, although the MDGs were sectarian in terms of not being global, it influenced how the SDGs are constructed. So I would just quickly go into, in a sense, as we asked the question, the ranking by society of what their needs are. And then, of course, access to water, lack of employment, cost of electricity. I was the statistician general of South Africa for many years, 17 years. And when we looked at this, education was number 15. Now, the question is, politics drive public opinion and public priorities. And no politics will go and advocate for something that is priority number 15 as expressed by citizens. Now, the intersection of politics and technical and the real needs that society feels seems to have a major gap, and the role of politics and role of society very crucial. Here, you see the number of children that are born in South Africa, year in, year out, up to 2016, and the enrollment of these children from 2010 to 2016, number of those who wrote matric, number of those who passed, and the ratio of pass rate. I mean, this indicator, should we measure the success by dividing this number of learners by those who wrote matric, or should we measure this by dividing this number by the number of children that were born and qualified to write matric in 2016, which is this number 4 for this, over 984, which will mean that the percentage pass is much lower than 72%, because all these others fell, by the way. So measurement for what purpose? I wouldn't like to take long, but here is a progression ratio imputed from the census data. The census is a time machine, and it puts 4 races up here: black, colored, Indian, and white. And these three are the ones that Mandela was talking about. And here you can see, if you were to measure in the census people who were born as early as 1940 and put them across time, and in 2011 measure them, you find how much they have progressed to have been at grade 7 after having passed grade 3. Here is having been at grade 9 after having completed grade 3, and grade 12 having completed grade 3. So you can see progressively as a smaller percentage of proportion across time has. Now, when you look at the outcomes of education at tertiary, where the skills have to be taken, which is a goal 4.4, I think, and by race, you'll see what happens here between whites, Indians, and blacks. And you can see the decline amongst blacks over time. Over here, the gradient is the same, although the y-intercept is not the same because fewer blacks went to university. But in terms of access and success, they had. But beyond that point, they don't perform well because there may be access, but funding for this is not available. So measuring this information from multiple perspectives, if we were to look at education for what purpose, and you look at between white and black, here you can see those who are graduates as a proportion of the population. Here you could be talking to Korea because Korea has the highest proportion of graduates across all ages against the black population where the graduates are so few. And when you ask what education for what purpose, as a stock for development, what are the interventions that have to be made? And what are the political interventions that have to be made? Who are the advocates, who are the collaborators, and who are the brokers in this space where you can see that development in South Africa will fail if this other side, which is the majority population, 95% of the population, have this kind of graduate distribution. And of course, in absolute numbers, you can see that South Africa has a very weak reach. So in South Africa, there's a lot of data. There's no doubt around education and so on. But how is it advocated for youth is a big problem. I think I leave it at this point where I talk about multidimensionality, and multidimensionality, like interdisciplinarity, actually is the way to go. And here we can see the drivers of poverty in South Africa are actually the unemployment levels, which has doubled in half the time if you look at this period here. And years of schooling that have improved somewhat, as you can see from 11 years in 20, or rather, no schooling, 16%, 14% to 11%, improved somewhat. But when you combine the years of schooling and unemployment, you actually come to a very disastrous percentage of 63% of South Africa's problems are driven by lack of employment and its interlocutor, which is education. Yet the politics and the priorities around sanitation, energy, water, and so on, as I showed you the priorities. So how do you advocate, therefore, through information and statistics, being sociologists and others, for something like education as a holistic system that improves the stock of business solutions for a country? I leave it there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Palilahula, and thank you very much, Professor Soteria Grech, for those great interventions. Now we have approximately 15 minutes for questions from the audience. Please do populate the chat with your questions or comments. I can start with a few that came through earlier, and I'll just share a few of them, and then open up for your reflections first, Soteria, and then Polly, if you want to add. So one of the questions that came through kind of as we were transitioning was around this comment about the most important thing to think about is how people can receive the data because there are people with low capacity. So what are kind of the intersections of capacity and data use with the data that is produced? And then there's questions around access to data, right? So are there some data maybe that are more accessible than others, and what does that mean for some of these issues that you've raised in this presentation? And then as Mara already said, a lot of positive comments about how interesting the presentation was. And then the third comment, just so you have 3 to work with for the time being, is around this reflection from Radhika that when speaking to those people, quote unquote, on the ground, who are generating a lot of the data, it's very burdensome, and they have to do so in many contexts without computers, without electricity, and they feel as if it seems to be feeding an insatiable data machine, Radhika wrote. So questions around capacity to use data, access to data, and the role of those that are tasked with producing.
Thanks, Daniel. If I could start before passing over to Pali, who I think will know more than me on this. But yeah, our project, started with this idea that we would look at international organizations, right? I mean, this was the level. You can do everything in a project, but of course, as you understand, increasingly these questions of the national and the local, and how the impact that we find on the national level because of this work that happens transnationally was very evident. So I think it's really important to understand that this concept of harmonization, which is different from kind of standardization, in the sense that harmonization is all about kind of making things kind of click so that they can both work at the local level and the national. I think the prevalent picture at the moment is that the SDGs and all these global monitoring exercises happen often at the expense of local needs. What is even more worrying, I think, beyond kind of education, is the fact that one of the cases in our project looked at statistical capacity building. It's this SDG 17. It's about partnerships and creating kind of data systems for the developing world, particularly, so that, and there you hear ideas around kind of nationalizing the SDGs, so turning a whole national statistical system into one that can correspond and works with these global agendas. And I think that's very dangerous, because it might actually, the whole exercise might be missing the point of what is really at stake here and what are the local needs. So I think a rethink is overdue about this. Radhika's comment is absolutely key, and again we see this all the time. I think national policy actors are somewhere in the middle of trying to deal with very real everyday problems, like kind of poverty or lack of electricity or basic human needs, versus being pleasing the donors, and collecting the data that people who come in with educational investments want from them. So I think that it's a really tricky world, and I don't think there is a going back. Now education is global, is transnational, these comparisons are there, and people want to know about other countries, and they want to compare themselves with others so that they learn and about best practice, so that they can improve, so that we have this kind of peer pressure. But I think we should also be cognizant of the challenges and the dangers of moving in this kind of almost unidirectional strategy of just creating global learning metrics, and in fact very specific and narrow global learning metrics.
Thank you for that, Soteria. And Dr. Pali, would you like to add some thoughts on that, on the question of capacity, access, and the role of those that are tasked with collecting the data?
Well, I think that there's definitely an issue around capacity, but there is more an issue around accessing the reasons why we do certain things, and the role of memory in that which we do. When we are growing up, there used to be a register that a teacher ticks every day against a name of a child who is there. Of course, when I was growing up in Lesotho and at grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, There were days when some of the boys would have to go and head cattle, and they are not at school. And then, of course, there was a name for that absence, being absent on that day, and then the next day they are back. And that register was available. So what makes education statistics so difficult? When now we even have a technology that can actually ensure that you know the number of children that are at school, attendance register every day, and you aggregate it into all forms. It all starts with that particular child stepping at the school. There's nothing difficult at that level to keep that register. So at some levels, it's just a pure neglect, malicious neglect. Now, then it's upping the use of that data. And the use of that data must be by the children themselves. I went to a school in rural KwaZulu-Natal as I was advocating for census. We started talking about how many children are in this class. And they were not so sure. So I said, guess. So they guessed, and then I started plotting the responses from those who responded, and then plotted the graph. And then started how many are not here, and how often are they not here. There was no register. A simple thing that has to be there every day, and then aggregated upwards in order to keep the numbers of. But the most crucial thing is knowing that there is a conception of a life that will come. There is a birth, and that birth will have to access school one day. Now that progression of life through life is a very important thing that we should have. When we don't have that right at the beginning as a foundation, then we have missed all the others, because the purpose of life is lost. So all this advocacy and the tyranny of data and tyranny of other tyrannies manifests itself because life is not recorded at the most crucial of its being when it is created and what its purpose should be through life.
Thank you for both of those reflections. So please do keep the questions coming. I do see a hand up from Bashir Mahmoudi, but I wonder if that's a hand from earlier. Apologies if I'm not pronouncing the name correctly. Bashir Mahmoudi, do you have a question? In the meantime, I see a comment there from Radhika saying, I have some data on how trust within communities is impacted by this intense focus on data. Does anyone else have similar observations on how the data focus has impacted communities? And I think she's asking also those in the chat to respond to that. But I wonder, you've already mentioned some, Soteria and Pali, but I wonder if you have thoughts on how this sort of data regime is impacting communities.
Could you come again? My connection became a little bit weak there.
Radhika was asking if you have reflections on how communities have been affected by the intense focus on data.
Well, I would argue that, well, in my experience, the communities have not been focused so much on data, at least in the case of South Africa, in as far as education is concerned.
Sorry to interrupt you, Palia, but she was just clarifying that, especially the issue of trust of communities. Sorry, go ahead. Continue.
Yes, I mean, yes. I don't even think that it is the issue of trust for data. It's the loss of trust for governance and loss of trust and demand for things that such as other services other than education. So when it comes to education data, it doesn't even feature as an issue for consideration. So a lot of advocacy has to be in place from a point of outcomes of education for society to start appreciating, and I think they do appreciate the importance of education, but they haven't established the locus from which they have to articulate and actively advocate for better education. And that's the case in South Africa. In the case of many other countries, yes, we are all concerned about education, but from a point of view of children go to school, but they don't get employed. So the impact of lack of education or good education is translated or visible when people don't get employed. And that's where the pressure is. It's at the end, not at the beginning of life. And I'm saying we've got to turn that on, re-engineer it, that it must be at the beginning of life to express what path has to be there.
Can I just come in on this, Daniel, for a moment? I mean, I absolutely have not a problem. I think data, and it's the only way for us to know education systems. We absolutely need to collect it. There's no question about that. The question for me, and what I tried to raise in the keynote, is this the fact that we've almost become servants of the data itself. We can't think differently. We can't think, it's not just the tool that we use in order to know ourselves better and our education systems better, but it has become the only frame within which we can understand and create education values, by turning them into goals and targets, and then moving on to collecting data about them. And this is really what my point was.
Thank you, that was helpful. I see a question that came in for you, Satira, saying, there's a question earlier of who are the we by, this is from Patrick, who are the we by Radhika, implying that the we could be and is likely abused to associate some form of general will of the people to only a select few. Isn't it similarly debatable to use the they when talking about IO, international organizations, and experts as a group when they have such a diversity of political mandates, representation, even though with converging part in their narratives? In particular, the agenda discussed by UNESCO has been officially endorsed by all member states at the UNGA, which is admittedly different from an agenda put forth by the World Bank or the OECD.
Thanks, Patrick. That's absolutely correct. And that was my point. I earlier said, look at what we are doing today. There's no they. We are all into this and taking part in this and constructing it, thinking only through this specific way of thinking, through a kind of quantified perspective on education and thinking about data. National policy actors are no victims here. They're absolutely part of these processes. They are there and they do approve them. It is not, this is not some conspiracy theory, not at all, but it's the way that the data actually, in other work of mine, we call this an epistemic infrastructure. There's this infrastructure of measurement that we're all part of, and it's impossible for any one of us to actually lead it. It kind of operates through creating these zones of visibility through the production of data and invisibility, where we know little. In fact, often people call this strategic ignorance. There is intentionally, we don't look at specific data because it might not suit us. So this is what quantification has constructed, this infrastructure of measurement, and we're all in this together, I'm afraid. This is really my effort to say, let's be a bit reflexive about where we are and what we're doing with this and where we're heading. I mean, there will always be missing data because this is what the structure kind of feeds on. There has to be missing data so that this missing data can be found, and then we'll never have we'll never reach the absolute goal of having all the data. That is for sure.
And if I can come in, I mean, that's where the Maulana metaphor comes in, that at all times there'll always be a Maulana effect. But to try and say that all solutions are where there is light, then at night, there cannot be solutions. And where there is no light, lie no solutions. And therefore, our search is limited to the God of data, instead of to how life is constructed and how it is lived beyond the narrowness of data. For a former chief statistician to almost be seen to be condemning data, that must be blasphemy. But certainly, I think the tyranny of data and the tyranny of markets, where, as Jessica was saying, now what is important becomes which head is followed, and that defines the importance. And that, I think, is the wrong thing. And importance, by definition, is elite, is elitist, because they define that space. We really have to go back to what Mandela said. Some children are children at school whose parents have never seen the inside of the school. It is those parents whose views must actually influence the statistics of education. That, I think, is the essence of this.
Thank you both for those reflections. So I know we're a little bit over, but I'll just take kind of two more comments. There's a bunch more coming in. We won't be able to get to all of them. But so one is around the question of data literacy. This is for Angela Arnott, and around the SDGs being written for an elitist language and how that limits kind of accessibility to many communities. And the other is by Ken McBean, talking about, are there ways that, you know, the importance of multidisciplinarity, and are there ways that we can incorporate business perspectives, especially for continuous quality improvement, and how that seems to be lacking in the education sector. So around data literacy and the elitist, potentially elitist language of SDGs and what that means, and around business practices of continuous improvement and how that might be useful in
I could take it. I think data literacy is absolutely important, and understanding, you know, the limitations of data, but also how data is also constructed. You know, there are different ways of putting data together in order to understand the world. So absolutely, we need to work further with that. Secondly, you know, in terms of the commercial aspect, well, I think commercial actors have a lot of say already in education, and they, you know, they have quite a bit of influence in recent years. So I wouldn't worry about not having their participation and influence in the field. That's for sure.
Well, I think in the data world, and obviously from a statistics point of view, and looking at the UN 10 fundamental principles for official statistics that prescribe how the conduct of those who are in that field should be, is a separation of interests from the data itself. And then, of course, that is a very important aspect, and so that those who collect the data are not in the space of influencing the policy itself and the policy outcomes. The data can be used to influence policy, but for the data, there shouldn't be data peddling and then outcomes peddling by those who are in the business of producing the data. Nothing wrong with advocacy for utilization of data and demonstration of outcomes when data is used, outcomes that are bad or good. But I think the positions of the roles from advocacy, collaborator, and broker, it's an important one that one should be conscious of at all times as they go through those particular roles. Because at times you have to play all three roles. But that consciousness and putting your cards on the table around your role is very important. Including, but those with commercial interests don't often become explicit about the commercial interests. And when there is a data and commercial interests, you see tyrannical conduct.
So I would like to just give a warm thank you to Professor Soteria Grech and Dr. Palilahola for the very interesting session, and to all of you for the interesting comments and questions. There are many more comments coming through, and people are very stimulated, so thank you both for your interesting remarks. So now, excuse me, if you will, we'll transition to the last and short session. So thank you for your energy and attention so far. And so this is just, we've been talking at this global level, but we wanted to take a moment to get some thoughts at the regional level. So as part of this project, we've had these regional pieces being developed. And so I would like to invite 3 additional speakers to the floor for this discussion. So we'll have Karma El Hassan, who is a professor at the American University of Beirut, and Alejandro Vera, who's with UNESCO in Santiago, and Angela Arnott, who's with she wears many different hats, and she's a data expert in the continent of Africa. And so I'm inviting the 3 of them to open your video, and hopefully you're all co-hosts, so you can unmic. So I'll ask Alejandro first to share his thoughts on, we've heard these different perspectives. What does this look like at the regional level? So which of the things have you heard that resonate and are similar, and which are different, if you were to pick kind of 2 or 3 highlights from your perspective, things that you think you've heard today that are also true for Latin America and the Caribbean, and perhaps 1 or 2 things that you think are quite different. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for the invitation, for the opportunity to share this meeting. And of course, the presentation has been very interesting, and the speakers excellent. First of all, I have to say that most of the discussion that we had today had a lot of sense, or make a lot of sense in our region. Many of the trends at the global level that have been presented by you and the rest of the speakers are present in our region. So I will focus perhaps in 2 apparent contradictions that there is between the data, the availability of data and its use, the availability of data and its at the different levels, and perhaps to highlight 3 or 4 challenges that we have in the region. The first contradiction was presented by you, Daniel, at the very beginning of the meeting. It seems that we have more data, perhaps we have more education data than even the history. But at the same time, there is a stagnation or a declining availability of data. The lack of data at the global, at the regional level, doesn't mean that this data is not a national level. So that is happening in our countries. So the challenges that arise here is that first we have to work in the comparability of data. Why? Because what is happening? There is new dimension, there is new variables that the SDG 4 framework has bring to the table, especially all the work in excluded population that perhaps are not well worked at the national level in terms of standard, in terms of comparability issues, and we need to work with that. Examples, how we treat at national level, I mean in national operation statistics, household survey or census, how we treat people with disability, how we treat people on the move. So there is comparability issues that are not being worked, so we have a lack of comparable data at the regional and the global level. And the second challenge is the role of regional organization, global organization, those which are in charge of monitoring framework, still need to make an effort in order to support countries to report the data and to make it comparable. Now, there is a role for us as UNESCO and all the organizations that are working in this monitoring framework. So if we say that at the national level there is data, so when we have the second contradiction, that it seems to be an imbalance between the availability of data and its proper use for policy making. That was aroused as well by different people during this meeting. So we have a lot of data, but governments, Ministry of Education are not using it. And why we see it? There are a lot of reasons for that. But something that was presented by Marcos in his presentation is that perhaps this data is beyond the boundaries of what the Ministry of Education usually use, which is the EMIS. What Marcos presented at the data at the UIS and the data in other sources as household surveys or learning assessment studies, the same happened at the national level. Ministry of Education rely on their EMIS and perhaps don't pay a lot of attention to other sources as household surveys of a learning assessment. And more with these sources are regional or global. How is the use of PISA, or how is the use of teams in a Ministry of Education, or even traditional household service as MICs or DHAs. So then we have a problem. So perhaps the EMIs in our region, what were built 2 or 3 decades ago, have a traditional perspective. Were built with the previous agenda. We have the ODM, the EFA's agenda based on enrollment, completion, progress. And now the SDG 4 agenda comes with a lot of demands, and perhaps the EMIS, the national EMIS, has not evolved to give answer to this demand. So then we have the other challenges that we see in the region. First of all, of course, trying to support countries to make this step, to jump from traditional EMIS to a traditional view of the EMIS to a more comprehensive, a more integrated EMIS. Because data is there, and not only the data, there has been a democratization of method, challenges, skills. Everybody can do it. So it's a question of support countries to make it more comprehensive, to make their EMIS more integrated. And finally, I know that we have a little time where I am finishing with this. Perhaps the last challenge is to trying to make this classical virtual cycle of the production and use of data. That is something that people who dedicate to statistics, I myself dedicate to that, because we are always concentrated in the production of data and we don't pay attention on the use of this data. And that is something that we are seeing as a problem in the policy making processes. Perhaps there is a lot of data. There are more and more sophisticated ways of analyzing and processing the data, but the people who take the decision are not using it. So that is a big question mark. What we can make to make a bridge between these two worlds. So thank you again, and I'm happy to share with all of you.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. So I'll now turn it over to Angela Arnott, who, among many other roles, is Director of Program for Results, for her reflections on any differences unique to the African continent.
Thank you, Daniel, and I hope my video is on. Yes. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to an audience that I'm unfamiliar with, because I'm a policy expert in the sense that I'm always working with ministries of education and not with academics. I just want to say I've really appreciated the conversations. It's been extremely interesting. I found that it certainly opened my mind in terms of the framework for measuring SDGs that Marcus shared with us. although I would say that it would not necessarily work that well for the Africa region, because the data categorizations that are being proposed aren't necessarily standard across many of the African countries, such as rural and urban, such as private schools are necessarily better than public schools. I think there was another area about indigenous languages and non-indigenous languages, which are quite controversial on our continent. You know, is Arabic an indigenous language or not? Many people say it would be. So there's a, you know, I'm looking at that framework and saying, well, how well would it work? I really appreciated the conversation from and the presentation by Soteria on how the international organizations are framing the agenda. And this is something that I feel quite strongly about, because I would argue that there needs to be a lot more rethinking around the SDGs and how they're being bought into by countries. That I don't think there's enough consensus by many African countries on. It's not that there isn't a desire for equity and social justice, because that is a very strong value that goes right through, I'd say, the whole of the region. But it's that many of those SDGs are nice to have and not necessarily in line with national and local priorities. There's a lot of, I mean, I've spoken, I think, about the language. In the chat, I mentioned that the language in which they are worded is often unintelligible to many of our, not only communities, but also technicians within the ministries of education. So even if there were the resources, and that is a huge issue, and the technical capacities, it's not always easy for second language speakers to even get to grips with some of the concepts that are behind them. And the issue of resources is so paramount. I mean, Africa has probably the hugest number of countries that are at the poorest among the world. And we have something like 58% of our learners of secondary school age not in school. So when you're faced with those sort of challenges of not having enough resources, of not having enough children in school, obtaining just the absolute essentials of access and quality, the issues around inclusivity of learners with disabilities, learners with special needs, child-friendly schools, you know, become overwhelming when you haven't even got your basic utilities in place. So I would say that there hasn't been enough engagement with policymakers who understand the technical issues to have their voice heard in these global debates on data. I think that I heard, as let me get the name right, Soteria said, you know, countries have endorsed the SDGs, but who's endorsed the SDGs? It's largely politicians, or it's senior policymakers who are politicians in African countries. And I think that there needs to be a much more internal debate within Africa around, you know, what do these SDGs mean, and how can we perhaps have voice in this, because countries don't have the resources to actually implement it. And I've found that in most instances, most ministries of education seldom look at the UIS data. It's often absent from their desks, from their way of assessing themselves against other countries. So it's a very narrow focus just on what exists within their own national EMIS systems, and trying to address the education sector objectives. And the drive is largely coming from these international organizations, and it's not internal. It's not something that's truly been bought into. So I would say that is the biggest fundamental challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela, for those reflections. So now I'll turn it over to Karma El-Hassan from American University of Beirut.
Good afternoon. and I'm really happy to join you. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend the presentations nor the discussions. I came at the end because of prior commitments, but I thankfully to Daniel, he shared the presentations, and I really had a quick look at them, and I know I missed a lot, and I'm looking forward to go over the recordings once they are available. From what I looked at the presentations, there are many similarities between what we are having in the Arab region and between what we heard and what was presented in the various presentations. When I referred to Daniel's presentation, you know, the points mentioned regarding disaggregation of data and building statistical capacity of countries to deal with the data and to integrate the various sources of data is a challenge that we are all facing, I think, in the Arab region. With respect to missing data on groups, many of the groups you mentioned, Daniel, in your presentation, we're having missing data on them. Those with learning disabilities, the rural areas, you know, our countries are suffering from conflict. We have refugees, and there are many different groups, and some of the groups you mentioned are also we miss data on them in our region. I looked at Marcus' presentation, and I agree with him that there is missing data, basically, especially with regard to learning surveys and household surveys, and we need to really enrich our data with this kind of information. And I really fully agree on the issue of the framework. I think one of the issues that we really were missing a framework for our data collection and so on. And on my presentation on Thursday, I'm going to highlight on the importance of in the region on a framework for a policy framework for policy making, and accordingly, we don't see any integration and alignment between the different policies and the different projects that are going on. So these are some of the things I agree with Marcus. However, the kind of combinations that you are suggesting, I feel they are, although they are very important regarding the learning outcomes and the completion rates, you know, the combination of data you're suggesting that we can come up with. I feel that, you know, when nearly 50% of the countries in the region are unable to provide more than 50% of the data, this becomes a bit too complicated for us, really, and far beyond what we can really provide and what we can aim for. But really, we are, in many instances, we are at the basic level, but that would be really important for the future. I also enjoyed Satiria's presentation and her new forms of knowledge production. And, you know, being a professor of education and measurement, I'm always interested in the conceptual understanding and the conceptual framework. And I liked your mode 1 and mode 2 and mode 3. Unfortunately, I could not see ourselves beyond mode 2. You know, many of the items or the dimensions under your mode 3, maybe I misunderstood them because I didn't attend the presentation, but I see that we're more at mode 2 than the mode 3 dimensions. But it was a very interesting presentation, and I look forward to hear the recording. Now, with respect to the Arab region, as I mentioned, many similarities with the missing data and the missing groups. The processes would probably be different, but we have our own local context too. And, you know, we are a region with 4 sub-regions, and there are vast differences between these 4 sub-regions. So we cannot really generalize to the region as a whole. And we need to take each sub-region by itself, and as there are many differences, and we are also we have the conflict issue and the refugee issue, and there are many indicators that are characteristics of the local situation, and I look forward to sharing them with you on Thursday in my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you to Alejandra and Angela and Karma for some of those regional reflections. And just a big thank you to everyone. With that, I'm going to turn it over for some closing remarks from Moira.
So all that's left for me to do is to say thank you so much to everyone who's come to this opening of our Missing Education Data Summit, and also particularly those people who have contributed and stimulated such a rich conversation here. As you will have heard at the end there, as well as the global piece that was presented today, we are also developing regional papers, and also specifically another discussion around education in emergencies, and also education and gender. And so with the record, going back to what I said at the beginning, this is the beginning of this process and project for us. We look forward to more of you becoming involved as we continue to go ahead with this. There are some links that Daniela has just put into the chat that might be of interest to some of the people who are here today. And finally, don't forget you can become a member of the NORRAG network in order to keep up with everything that we're doing and to make sure that you are part of this very important conversation going forward. So thank you all for your time today, whether it's been morning, afternoon, or evening, and we look forward to welcoming you again soon. Thank you so much. Goodbye.